So in this section, I'll talk a little bit about how Argentine tangos from a musical perspective are formed. First thing we want to do is listen for the typical instruments. The typical instruments that we have are the bandoneon, violins, piano, bass, and the singer. And each play a real important role in forming the rhythmic side of the song as well as the melodic side. If we start just talking about the rhythmic accompaniment, when you put on any Argentine tango, you're going to hear a melody and you're going to hear an accompanying rhythm. Some basic ideas in that are called the marcado. The marcado is the sort of staple rhythmic accompaniment that any of the instruments can play, and on the bandoneon, it will sound like this. What you'll notice is that it's very accented, it's short and sharp, that it's not played really long, that it has a certain bite to it. And musicians will refer to this type of marcado as a marcado in 4. With one of those pieces being accented and the other being unaccented. And so that gives us a sense of where the slow beat lies and where our quick slows lie when we actually dance. Another type of rhythmic accompaniment is called the marcado in 2, and that sounds like this. So it has that heavily accented part with a little more emphasis, and then there's no unaccented part in it. So the more rhythmic sounding orchestras will employ this marcado in 4, which I call the chum chum. So it keeps going chum chum, chum chum. And the more lyrical orchestras or dramatic orchestras will be using more the marcado in 2 with just the chum, chum, chum. So when you hear the marcado, that's sort of the fundamental or base rhythmic accompaniment that we have. On top of that, we have certain highlight rhythms that we use. One is called the syncopa, which is a syncopation, and it sounds like this. So if I'm just going along playing a marcado in 4 and I transition into a syncopa, it would sound like this. Here's the marcado in 4. Syncopa. Back to a marcado in 4. So when you hear the syncopa, it will only be played several times, and it's not always played in a location that's formulaic. Different orchestras might use more of that or less of that to get their signature feel. There's also a highlight rhythm called the 3-3-2, which sounds like this. Sort of long, long, short, long, long, short, long, long, short. Again, that's going to be used as a highlight rhythm in the same way that the syncopa is being used. Sometimes you'll hear what's called a pesante. Pesante is just a long, drawn-out sort of rhythm that accompanies more lyrical sections of a tango. That would sound something like this. So you can kind of sense that it has a little bit of a heavier, slower feel to it. Again, each instrument interprets these rhythms, the marcados and the highlight rhythms, in their own unique ways. But in terms of the accentation or how those rhythms are made is going to be the same throughout the instruments. So if we talk a little bit about the melody now, the melody is the thing that you can hum or that you can whistle. And the melody can be played one of 2 ways. The melody can be played legato. Legato means lyrically, or staccato, which means short. So if we take a basic melody like La Comparsita that we all know, if I play it staccato, that would be interpreted in a staccato fashion or a very short, sharp, rhythmic way. And if I played the exact same melody more legato or lyrically, it would sound like this. And when the melodies are played more lyrically, whoever's playing the melody tends to mess with the time a little bit. And that's something that's called rubato, a musical term. Rubato in Italian, that means to steal. And what's being stolen is time. So you wouldn't play it exactly on time. You would stretch out one note a little longer and then play the next notes a little bit shorter in order to catch up. And that gives the song a very certain expressive quality to it. When the notes are being played staccato or very short and sharp, the orchestras always play them precisely in time in a very short rhythmic manner. So any instrument can play the melody. Typically the bass doesn't take the melody, but the piano, bandoneon, singer, or violin tend to take it. There's also something called the counter melody. And the counter melody is a second melody that will be happening concurrently while the melody is being played. So again, the layering would be you have the rhythm section playing a marcato or a syncopa or 3-3-2 or pesante. Then on top of that, you have the melody. And on top of that, you could have a counter melody. If there's a counter melody, the counter melody is a melody that's not in the original composition, but it's one that the orchestras would compose or invent in order to give the arrangement a little more complexity. If there is a counter melody, the counter melody is typically always played legato or lyrically. And when that's happening, the main melody, which is being played at the same time, typically is being played staccato and more in the background, again, while the rhythm's going on. So when you're dancing, you might try to listen for these different layers that are going on. We'll be talking about a little bit later in this series, but also the way the melodies are formed is that they're formed in phrases. In tangos, typically of 8 slow beats long. So you hear a melody start, and then it will sort of come to an end around the 8th beat. Now, near the end of a melody, sometimes you'll hear a little musical flourish by one of the instruments. If you listen to Di Sarli, typically it's in the piano. If you listen to Enrique Rodriguez, typically it's in the bandoneons. It's called a musical fill. That's a little tiny musical flourish or idea in order to link the melodies. Again, when one melodic arch of 8 slow beats comes near an end, you have a musical fill, and then the next melodic arch of 8 slow beats will start. So we want to be listening for the phrasing, for the fills, for the rhythm section, for the melodies, for the counter melodies. Near the end of a tango, sometimes you'll hear the bandoneons or occasionally the violins start to play really fast notes, and that is called the variación, or variation, on the original theme. And when you hear the variation, typically the variation is played right as the tango is ending. It's also a very idiomatic thing that happens in Argentine tango, the variación. On top of that, you'll hear some other things. There are no drums typically in Argentine tango, but each instrument has their way of interpreting percussive sounds on the bandoneon. You can tap the side of the instruments or do this with the buttons. The violin can tap the end of the scroll. The bass can hit the back of the bass. The piano might do a glissando where they play all the notes down. Again, different effects to give it a sort of percussiveness that also helps drive the danceability. So in the next sections, we'll take a look at each of these pieces and then ultimately ideas for interpreting these pieces.